Next, we have Ms. Emily Schaeffer Omer-Man, who is a human rights lawyer based in Tel Aviv. Prior to founding a new law practice in 2018 that brings strategic litigation abroad against human rights violations committed under the Israeli occupation, she served as senior counsel and acting director of the Michael Sfard Law Office. Alongside attorney Sfard, she litigated constitutional challenges before the Israeli Supreme Court, including representing the West Bank village of Bil'in in reclaiming land annexed by the wall and successfully challenging the Israeli army's use of white phosphorus in Gaza. Emily served as legal counsel to the Israeli human rights NGO Yesh Din, where she represented over 500 Palestinian victims of crimes committed by Israeli soldiers and police. She also provided legal counsel to human rights defenders and leading human rights organizations, among them Breaking the Silence, Peace Now, Who Profits, the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, Al-Haq, and Human Rights Watch. Emily?
Thank you. This is an incredibly poignant moment to be speaking about annexation in the context of Israel and Palestine, and so I would like to thank the committee for choosing this as the topic of today's forum, and likewise for inviting me to speak before you today. As we heard earlier this morning, with plans for de jure annexation of large portions of the West Bank featuring front and center on the tickets of many of Israel's mainstream political parties ahead of national elections just next week, the Trump administration's nod to Israeli occupation and annexation policies, exemplified particularly by the recent recognition of Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, and in a post-Brexit moment of distraction, could say, by the EU, we find ourselves in a highly dangerous state of affairs, one that is moving the needle of what is tolerable further away from international legal norms and closer to flagrant violations of basic human rights, basic Palestinian human rights, which are increasingly becoming normalized. I believe that before we can engage in a meaningful discussion about appropriate strategies for combating imminent or even accomplished annexation, we need to lay out a definition of annexation. And I say this not to be didactic or repetitive of my colleagues from this morning, but because oftentimes we need to remind ourselves of the rationale and spirit behind annexation's illegality so that we can be keenly alert to all of its subtle attributes. Annexation, simply put, means asserting sovereignty over a foreign territory. And Professor Link this morning laid out the vast legal foundations behind the prohibition. But if I can just add here to his presentation, the prohibition on annexation, just like the prohibition on settlement by the occupying powers' civilians in the occupied territory, is not born only of the consensus reached in the earlier part of the 20th century, in particular by the UN Charter, about the illegitimacy of acquiring territory by force, but it is also fundamentally rooted in the international community's deep concern over the welfare and basic rights of civilians trapped in disputes over territory, regardless of which armies instigated them or for what reasons, and because of the ultimate value placed on self-determination of the occupied population. Settlements are not just illegal because Article 49.6 of the Fourth Geneva Convention states that they constitute prohibited population transfer, and the Rome Statute of the ICC has codified the acts as a war crime. And not just because they thwart genuine peace negotiations. Settlements are illegal in order to protect the civilians living under occupation. International humanitarian laws protected persons. To prevent demographic changes in the occupied territory, to prevent displacement of one population in favor of another, to prevent discrimination, oppression, or worse. This is why settlements are illegal, and this is why changes to the territory or to the laws in place are prohibited, except where there's absolute military necessity or to serve the urgent needs of the occupied population. Because it is only natural that a foreign power would not have the best interest of foreign citizens in mind, or be able to place those foreign citizens' interests ahead of its own. And this is why an occupation must be temporary. For the millions of civilians who are trapped under foreign military rule to have a chance at basic political, civil, social, cultural, and economic rights and self-determination. Having the full set of rights which are at stake at the forefront of our minds is the first step to building smart, viable strategies for stemming annexation. To successfully prevent further annexation, we also must need to be acutely sensitive to the signs of annexation. As my colleague, Mr. O'Neill, astutely pointed out just a few moments ago, there are many stops on the road to full de jure annexation. And so I would like to caution all of us against responding only to major headline-worthy developments. Although more aggressive de jure annexation aspirations, including forcible transfer, have been recently unmasked among Israeli decision makers, and even perhaps accelerated, more quiet incremental steps leading to de facto annexation have been underway for years. And their insidious nature has allowed them to continue almost entirely unnoticed and unabated. When the symptoms of annexation have been challenged, even through the Israeli Supreme Court, perhaps the last institutional gatekeeper of Israeli democracy, they have almost invariably been addressed symptom by symptom or case by case, so that the root cause remains, for the most part, intact. If we wait for formal de jure annexation, it will have been too late. Every step, even seemingly benign, that further entrenches Israel's presence in the occupied territory, that increases Israeli control over Palestinian lives and territory, that normalizes the settlements and the extension of Israeli law to the territory, thereby making occupation more permanent and less reversible, is a paving stone on the way to full annexation. So in order to successfully combat annexation, we need to remember that sometimes the most dangerous and insidious advances toward annexation don't come in the obvious forms like the regularization law recently passed, allowing Israel to confiscate private Palestinian territory, private Palestinian land in the West Bank, but rather through a perhaps seemingly throwaway line in a Supreme Court or even lower court judgment that plants ideas for lawmakers and plants ideas for other courts. And a prime example of this is the increasingly popular conflation of the settler population with the Palestinian occupied population, the protective persons, by treating them both as members of the so-called local population, thereby elevating the status of the settler population and normalizing the application of Israeli law to them. The success of Israel's occupation has always been in its ability to make subtle incremental changes that fly under the radar and are anchored in sophisticated law, albeit a manipulation of customary interpretations of international law, but in many cases also breaking new ground and creating precedent in law and custom for other states to follow about how to administer an occupation under international humanitarian law. And so I want to put forth today the need to address even those subtlest attempts to deepen forms of de facto annexation, and including through the Israeli legal system. The Israeli courts can be extremely critical to the fight to stem annexation, if not to stop it in its tracks, at the very least to hinder its progress and to ensure that it does not go unnoticed or unchallenged, to force the system to contend with the inherent contradictions in its own fundamental principles and in the ultimate results of its laws and policies. In parallel, challenging creeping or de facto annexation will also require that third states engage in legal and diplomatic efforts to remind Israel not only of the bounds of IHL's occupation laws, but of their mere application, taking care to withhold recognition of Israeli laws, policies, and judicial decisions that contravene IHL. Third states need to make clear in every possible capacity the prohibition on annexation and all of its precursors, including ensuring that their own domestic legal systems are sufficiently robust to be capable and willing to enforce the law on their own companies and corporate entities when they are complicit in human rights abuses and war crimes in the occupied Palestinian territory, including in many cases directly facilitating the perpetuation of the occupation and a move toward annexation. These types of legal actions not only preserve the rule of law, but they also send an important signal to Israel about the international community's red lines when it comes to annexation and the human rights abuses inherent in it. So to close, I would like to offer that carefully designed legal interventions, both in Israeli and international and foreign tribunals, hold the potential for far-reaching impact to change the status quo and to move away from annexation and instead toward equality and self-determination. And I'm looking forward to engaging in a discussion today about viable legal and non-legal strategies to accomplish those goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily, for your intervention and for highlighting some possible methods to challenging the context of annexation.